Grass Valley, California, October 1885. The air, thin and sharp, carried the scent of pine dust and the distant tang of blasting powder from the quartz mines. On a small, windswept plot overlooking the Wolf Creek diggings, a man was engaged in a strange and strenuous act of architecture. His name was Trefor Penrose, and the men who stopped to watch him work had decided he was a fool. His cabin was finished, a tight, unremarkable box of 14 by 18 feet, built of fresh milled pine. It was identical to a dozen others clinging to the hillside. But Penrose wasn't chinking the walls or building a woodshed. He was wrestling with the mountain itself. Using a system of log levers, hemp rope, and raw muscle, he was coaxing granite boulders, some weighing up to 600 pounds, into a thick, formidable ring around his little home. Whitley Carrington, the surveyor for the Eureka Mining Company, reined in his horse, his polished boots a stark contrast to the churned mud of Penrose's work site. He sat high in his saddle, a man accustomed to measuring the world into straight lines and predictable angles. What he saw defied all logic. "What in God's name is that Cornishman doing now?" Carrington asked his companion, a grizzled foreman named Silas Croft. "Building a second house out of rocks, looks like," Silas grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "A damned sight bigger than the first one." The structure taking shape was a wall, but not a wall Carrington had ever seen. It was 4 feet thick, a chaotic jumble of gray and feldspar-flecked granite, laid with no mortar. Penrose worked with a quiet, unnerving rhythm, setting a massive core stone, then filling the gaps around it with smaller rocks and a slurry of gravel and clay he hauled in a wheelbarrow. He was leaving a deliberate, measured gap between his wooden cabin and the stone behemoth growing around it, an 18-inch chasm of empty air. Carrington's professional sensibilities were offended. "It's madness," he declared, his voice carrying easily to Penrose. "That much stone will draw the cold right into his walls. He's building himself a tomb. Worse, he's building it with company riprap." He gestured with a gloved hand toward the pile of boulders. "That's meant for the new flume dike down at the tailings pond. The watchman will be along to pull it all down by spring. See if he doesn't." Trefor Penrose paused, his back a rigid line of exhaustion. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand, leaving a smear of red dust. He looked at the surveyor, his blue eyes calm in a sun-weathered face. He said nothing, merely turned, picked up a smaller 50-pound stone, and fitted it into a void with the practiced ease of a man solving a puzzle he'd known his entire life. The stone settled with a soft, final thud. The mockery of the onlookers was just another sound in the wind. The validation, he knew, would be silent. What did this Cornish hedger, this builder of ancient field boundaries from the fog-shrouded coast of Penwith, understand about the physics of dead air and thermal mass that a trained surveyor, a man of instruments and calculations, had so completely missed? The answer to that question would be written in frost and fire, in survival and sorrow, across the brutal canvas of the coming Sierra winter. If you stick with us, I promise you will learn a principle of thermodynamics so powerful it can turn a mountain's bones into a blanket. Before we unpack that, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell for notifications. Let us know in the comments, what's the coldest temperature you've ever experienced? Trefor Penrose was not a carpenter. He was not a miner, and he was certainly not a frontiersman in the American sense. He was a hedger, a trade as old as the standing stones of his homeland. His hands understood the language of random-faced granite, the heft of fieldstone, the insulating properties of packed turf and gorse roots. In Cornwall, he had built the intricate earth-cored walls that had partitioned the land for 1,000 years. Walls that breathed with the seasons and held the warmth of the faint sun. He knew, in a way that went deeper than books, that a well-laid stone wall was not a solid object. It was a net, designed to catch and hold the most powerful insulator on Earth, still motionless air. He had come to California with his wife Morwenna and their 2 children Jago and Carenza, chasing not the glint of gold, but the promise of land, and a life away from the collapsing tin mines of home. They arrived late in the season of 1884, building their small pine cabin with the last of their money and the first of the autumn chill. That first winter was not a hardship. It was a lesson in torment, a physical manifestation of their mistake. The cold of the Sierra was nothing like the damp maritime chill of Cornwall. It was a dry, predatory thing. It had weight and teeth. Trefor and Morwenna learned its nature in a series of small, soul-crushing defeats. Morwenna remembered the morning a pewter spoon she'd set in a cup of coffee, glazed over with ice, and stuck fast to the rim before she could raise it to her lips. Jago, their son, discovered the dog's water bowl no longer sloshed. When he tapped it, it rang with a flat, dead note like cracked porcelain. The entire family watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the fragrant pine resin on the cabin's interior walls wept golden drops that froze solid before they could fall, hanging in suspended animation, monuments to a cold that could stop time itself. They burned wood constantly, a roaring, hungry fire that consumed the forest around them, yet the heat seemed to flee the cabin as quickly as it was made, escaping through the thin pine boards as if they were cheesecloth. The family lived in a small bubble of warmth 3 feet from the stove, while 6 feet away, frost bloomed in crystalline ferns on the nail heads. By spring, Trefor Penrose knew that the American way of building was wrong for this place. The problem wasn't the wood. The problem was the air. The frontier cabin was designed to shed rain and snow, to stand against the wind. It was a shell. But the Sierra winter didn't attack with wind and water. It attacked with a silent, invisible siege of pure cold, leaching the life and warmth out of everything. The conventional failure of the frontier cabin was a matter of simple, brutal physics. A standard wall of 1-inch pine planks offered an R value of about 1. It was thermally transparent. The immense heat generated by a wood stove, around 50,000 BTUs per hour, was fighting a losing battle against the infinite cold sink of the night sky. The heat radiated outwards, conducted through the wood, and was stripped away. Worse, the cabins were sieves. Cold air, being denser than warm air, poured in through every unchinked gap in the floorboards, every crack around the window frames, every slight warp in the door. This process, convection, created constant, chilling drafts. Families like the Connollys, in the cabin down the slope, stuffed rags and newspapers into the cracks. But it was hopeless. Their daughter, Maeve, had a cough that had settled deep in her chest in November and never left. The Schmidts, a German family who had arrived with a modest fortune, tried to solve the problem with brute force. They had 2 stoves, one at each end of their larger cabin, and burned them white hot around the clock. Their woodpile, which had seemed mountainous in October, was a sorry mound of splinters by January. The cost was astronomical, not just in wood, but in labor. Every waking hour was dedicated to feeding the fires. Yet even in their home, the temperature difference was extreme. It might be 80 degrees by the stove and 35 degrees in the corners of the room. Their reality was one of constant, exhausting fuel consumption for a pitiful return in comfort. The fundamental design was flawed. These cabins were built to fight a battle of brute force, a war of attrition against the cold. Trefor Penrose knew you could not win that war. You had to make peace. You had to build a structure that didn't fight the cold but simply ignored it. The construction of the stone shroud began in earnest in late September. Trefor's first step was to dig a shallow trench a full 22 inches out from his cabin's foundation, marking the inner boundary of his new wall. The 18-inch air gap was the most crucial and most misunderstood element of his design. To his neighbors, it was wasted space, proof of his incompetence. To Trefor, it was the heart of the machine. He began sourcing his material. The quartz hills were littered with granite boulders, weathered from the mountains over millennia. He chose them with a hedger's eye, looking not for flat, buildable faces, but for irregularity. He sought out the pocked, rough, convoluted stones that others discarded as useless. These, he knew, were the ones that trapped the most air. The largest, the 600-pounders he called grounders, he moved with agonizing slowness, using a simple fulcrum and lever, a thick pine log, and a smaller rock. He would lift one end of a boulder a few inches, kick stones under it, then reset his lever. It was a process of inches and hours, a silent, stubborn conversation between man and stone. He laid these massive grounders as the foundation of his 4-foot-thick wall. He never used mortar. Mortar was a bridge for cold. Instead, he used gravity and friction, turning each stone until it found its natural, solid seat against its neighbors. This was the art of dry stone, a skill that could not be taught, only learned through a decade of hefting and placing. It was during this phase that Whitley Carrington made his accusation public, telling anyone who would listen at the assay shed that Penrose was a thief. "Every one of those big stones was tagged for the Flume project," Carrington insisted, his voice laced with authority. "They're company property. I've told the watchman to let him break his back all autumn. Come the spring thaw, we'll haul them away for our own use. The fool is doing our quarrying for us." The news reached Trefor through Silas Croft, who delivered it not with malice, but with a kind of weary pity. Trefor was setting a mid-sized stone, his entire body tensed with the effort. He paused, straightened up, and looked at Silas. "Spring is a long way off," he said, his voice quiet. Then he returned to his work, fitting the stone into the wall. The mockery lasted for a day. The validation would last for a lifetime. His wife, Morwenna, watched from the cabin door, her expression a mixture of profound trust and practical worry. "It looks like a ruin, Trefor," she said one evening, as the stone wall rose past the height of the windows, like one of the old keeps back home that the sheep shelter in. "That's what it is, love," he answered, his hands raw and bleeding. "A place for shelter." He finished the outer courses, then began the laborious process of filling the core. He didn't use solid rock. That would conduct cold. Instead, he used a carefully mixed aggregate of smaller, fist-sized stones, gravel, and clay-rich soil. This mixture was not just filler. It was a critical part of the system, creating thousands more tiny, trapped air pockets within the wall's massive core. By the first week of November, the work was done. The small pine cabin had disappeared. In its place stood a low, powerful-looking stone structure, 22 feet by 26 feet, its battered gray walls rising to the eaves of the roof. It looked ancient, primal, a part of the landscape that had grown from the ground rather than being built upon it. It had one door and 2 windows which now looked out from deep, splayed stone embrasures, like the eyes of a fortress. The science behind Trefor Penrose's stone shroud was an elegant combination of 2 fundamental thermal principles. Principles he understood not through equations, but through a deep, tactile inheritance of craft. The first was dead air entrapment. The second was thermal mass. Together, they formed a nearly perfect passive heating and cooling system. Let's first address the dead air. The greatest mistake his neighbors made was thinking of the stone wall as a solid. It was anything but. A well-built dry stone wall is a complex 3-dimensional lattice of stone and air. Because Penrose deliberately chose irregular, rough-faced granite, the stones only touched at a few high points. Between any two boulders were countless voids, nooks, and crannies. When he backfilled the core with his gravel and clay mixture, he created millions more. Air flowed into these tiny pockets and was trapped. It could not move. And still, air is one of the most effective insulators in nature. Think of a wool sweater or a down jacket. It isn't the fibers or the feathers themselves that keep you warm. It is the millions of tiny air pockets trapped between them. This trapped air prevents heat from escaping your body through convection, the movement of warm air away from a surface. Penrose's wall was, in effect, a 4-foot-thick goose-down parka made of granite. A modern engineer would estimate that the network of voids in the wall, combined with the 18-inch deliberate air gap between the stone and the wood, gave the structure an R value of around R15. For comparison, the pine walls of the neighboring cabins had an R value of R1. Penrose hadn't just built a better wall, he had built something that was, thermally speaking, in a different universe. The second principle was thermal mass. Mass is a battery for heat. The sheer weight of the granite, Trefor had moved an estimated 85 tons of it, gave the structure an immense capacity to store thermal energy. On a clear day, even in winter, the sun would beat down on the south and west-facing walls. The dark, rough granite was an excellent absorber of solar radiation. All day long, it soaked up thousands of BTUs of energy from the sun, storing it deep within the 4-foot thickness of the wall. An engineer would calculate its storage capacity at roughly 8,000 BTUs per ton. When the sun set and the temperature plummeted, the process reversed. The outside air might drop 40 degrees in a few hours, but the 85 tons of granite could not lose its stored heat that quickly. It began to radiate its warmth slowly, steadily, in all directions. Some of it radiated out into the cold night air, but a significant portion radiated inward, across the 18-inch air gap, warming the outer walls of the pine cabin nestled inside. This created a profound thermal flywheel effect. The massive stone berm smoothed out the violent day-night temperature swings of the high Sierra. While the outside temperature might fluctuate from a sunny 25-degree hours in the afternoon to a devastating 20-degree hours at night, the temperature at the surface of the interior cabin wall would barely move, oscillating gently within a 4-degree range, perhaps from 58 degrees to 62 degrees. Trefor Penrose had built a house that lived in its own private, moderate climate, buffered from the savage extremes of the world outside. He had built a house that was its own season. That year, winter did not creep in. It fell from the sky like a guillotine. A vast, high-pressure system settled over the Sierra Nevada, pushing the jet stream far to the north. For 12 consecutive nights, the sky remained utterly, painfully clear. There was no wind, no snow, no insulating blanket of clouds. There was only the abyss of space, drawing the heat out of the earth. It was a radiative siege. The temperature fell to 23 degrees each night and struggled to rise above zero even at midday. The air grew so cold and dense, it felt like a liquid, painful to breathe. By the third morning, every needle on every conifer was clad in a 1-inch thick armor of hoarfrost. The trees transformed into ghostly white sculptures against a sapphire sky. The sound of an axe striking wood didn't ring. It shattered with a brittle crack that barely traveled 100 feet. Inside the other cabins, life became a grim battle. The Connollys hung blankets over their windows, but the cold crept through. The glass was sheeted with an inch of opaque ice on the inside, the delicate patterns of the children's breath frozen onto the pane. They huddled around their stove, feeding it with a desperate rhythm. At the Schmidts, the two stoves glowed cherry red, but the far corners of their large room were still frigid. They had abandoned their bedrooms, moving their mattresses onto the floor beside the main stove. A family of 4 camped in the center of their own home, as if besieged in a fort. The sound of wood splitting was constant across the valley, a frantic, panicked heartbeat against the profound silence of the cold. Inside the stone-shrouded cabin of Trefor Penrose, a different reality prevailed. The small wood stove was burning, but with a low, steady fire, its damper mostly closed. It consumed a fraction of the wood his neighbors were burning. The air was still and quiet. There were no drafts. The windows were clear, showing the crystalline world outside. The warmth was not a concentrated bubble around the stove. It was an even, ambient presence that filled the entire 14 by 18-foot space. The ultimate proof of this strange new comfort sat on a small shelf near the wall. It was a clay jar containing leftover filling for Cornish pasties, a savory mix of chopped beef, swede, and onion. Morwenna had made it the day before. Each morning during the siege, as the sun rose, she would take a knife and dip it into the jar. The filling was cool, but it was soft. It spread easily on a piece of bread. It was a small domestic miracle. In every other camp cook's kitchen in Grass Valley, any similar mixture was a frozen brick by morning, a solid block of ice and fat that had to be shaved with a chisel or thawed for an hour by the fire. Here, in the gentle, stable climate created by the stones, food remained food. Life remained normal. Jago and Carenza played on the floorboards, not in their heavy coats, but in their woolen sweaters, the cold held at bay by their father's strange, silent wall. On the 10th night of the siege, Whitley Carrington was riding back from a high court's claim, the work having been made impossible by the cold. His mule, exhausted and clumsy, was picking its way through the frozen landscape. As he neared Penrose's homestead, he cut across the man's property, his frustration with the cold making him careless. The mule, seeking the path of least resistance, plunged into a deep snowdrift that had accumulated against the north face of Penrose's stone berm. The animal sank to its shoulder, braying in panic. Carrington swore, dismounting into the waist-deep powder. The cold was shocking, a physical blow. He struggled to calm the animal, his hands, even in thick leather gloves, quickly growing numb. He pushed and pulled, his breath pluming in the still, frigid air. For half an hour he fought, his anger mounting. Finally, needing leverage, he turned and braced himself against the stone wall. He shoved his shoulder against it, and in the process, his bare hand, which he'd pulled from its glove to better grip the mule's bridle, slapped flat against the rough face of a large granite boulder. He froze. He expected a shock of biting, searing cold, a pain like grabbing solid ice. His mind was prepared for the granite to feel like the 20 seconds de guerre air surrounding it. But that is not what he felt. The stone was not warm, not in the way a fire is warm, but it was not cold. It was dry, and it held a faint, deep, and utterly impossible neutrality. It felt like stone on a cool autumn afternoon, not a frozen night in the depths of a Sierra winter. It was not leaching the heat from his hand. If anything, it seemed to be giving a tiny, ghost-like warmth back. He pulled his hand away as if burned, staring at the wall. He pressed his palm against it again, this time deliberately. He felt the rough texture, the solid mass, and he felt that impossible lack of cold. He looked up. Through the deep-set window, he could see the flicker of a single oil lamp. He saw the silhouette of Morwenna moving calmly about her kitchen. He saw a child's drawing tacked to the wooden wall inside. He saw normalcy, peace. He had come to mock a fool and instead had borne witness to a mystery. In that moment, standing in the freezing dark with his hand pressed against the impossible wall, Whitley Carrington understood that he had been wrong about everything. He didn't build a tomb, he thought. He built a harbor. The story of the surveyor and the warm stone wall traveled through the mining camps faster than a winter fever. It was a story too strange and too specific to be a lie. When the great cold finally broke, men began to visit the Penrose homestead, not to mock, but to learn. They would come and, with a kind of reverence, lay their own hands upon the stones. Trefor, a man of few words, would simply nod. He never said, "I told you so." He never gloated. When asked how it worked, he would try to explain. "The stones, they hold the sun," he'd say, "and the air, it holds the warmth. You just have to give them a place to stay." That spring, a traveling correspondent for the daily Alta California newspaper, a man with an interest in what he called mountain curiosities, heard the tale. He rode up to Grass Valley, interviewed Carrington, who had become Penrose's most vocal advocate, and spent an afternoon with Trefor. The writer sketched the strange, shrouded cabin, detailing its construction with surprising accuracy. The article, published in May of 1886, presented the structure not as the work of an eccentric, but as a stroke of practical genius. The idea spread. Miners and homesteaders were practical people. They didn't care about theory, they cared about what worked. They had all felt the misery of a Sierra winter in a pine box. By the autumn of 1887, 3 other Sierra mining camps had new structures built on the Penrose principle. They weren't as elegantly constructed as the original, but they followed the same logic: a thick, dry-stacked stone berm, an air gap, and an inner dwelling. The reports that came back the following spring were unanimous. The families in the stone-shrouded cabins had been warmer, more comfortable, and had burned less than half the firewood of their neighbors. The idea, born of ancient Cornish tradition, had taken root in the thin soil of the American West. What Trefor Penrose accomplished on that windswept hill was more than just good building. He was practicing a form of advanced thermal science a century before it would have a name. Modern architects and engineers speak of thermal mass walls, of rain screen principles, where an outer cladding protects an inner insulated wall, and of super insulation. They use complex software to model heat flow and energy transfer. Trefor Penrose had no such tools. He had only the knowledge passed down through generations, a wisdom held in the hands, not on the page. He had anticipated the core principles of modern sustainable building, not through abstract calculation, but through an intimate understanding of his materials. In the end, the story of the stone shroud is about a different way of seeing the world. His neighbors saw the granite of the Sierra as an obstacle, something to be blasted, crushed, and moved out of the way. They saw the landscape as an adversary to be conquered. Trefor Penrose saw it as a partner. He understood that the very thing that made the mountains so formidable, their immense cold, stony mass, could also be the source of comfort and shelter. He didn't build walls to keep nature out. He asked the mountain's bones to come live with the family. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering as fascinating as we did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like this. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other old world techniques do you think could solve modern problems? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.